Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deep deck dive, this time with a requested one for Mono Black. We are starting with the aggro version this time. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer deck guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and letting me know what deck you would like to see next in our deck guides. So Mono Black Aggro is an old stalwart of the Pioneer format that was popular when the deck was a little bit more powerful compared to the current power level of the format. It had access to Smuggler's Copter, which enabled it to fix some of the wrong half problems that these black aggressive or black mid-range decks have. And really was one of the powerhouses of the early Pioneer format, was able to hang with some of the combo decks and such that were a focus at that time because of the presence of Thoughtseize and Disruption being able to do what a lot of other things couldn't do. The problem that has occurred now is a lot of decks in the format have grown more powerful, while Mono Black really has not gained any noticeable new tools in the last year or two. So its power levels begin to lag a little bit behind the format, and therefore it's not as represented as it once was, but it's still a powerful disruption plus aggression deck that is something to be noted for if you're in a meta where that particular style is good. So what this deck pairs is it pairs the use of Thoughtseize and Fatal Push with aggressive, resilient creatures, making it very good in formats where control is heavy, as things like Blood-Soaked Champion with its raid ability, the Dread Wanderer with its ability to, whenever you're almost hell-bent, putting it back into play, or Scrapheap Scrounger for instant speed, exiling a creature and putting it back into play. Can do this at the end step for really threatening your opponent. It's going to really tax your opponent's removal, and one of the things that makes this deck very good is the fact that against non-exile based removal it happened to be very good. The problem becomes is a lot of those matchups that this deck used to hunt, hard combo decks and such, don't truly exist anymore, or are a lot more resilient to the effects of things like Thoughtseize, and also decks like Blue-White Control, which would previously be a pretty decent matchup, have started to run a lot more exile-based removal with things like the Wandering Emperor and March of Otherworldly Light. That said, this deck still has a lot of tools to disrupt your opponent and can threaten to kill quite quickly on turn 5 while disrupting with things like Thoughtseize and other hand disruption out of the sideboard. Also, being a monocolor deck, gets to play a lot of utility lands, things like Castle Lockdwayne allowed it to hang in the long games with these mid-range and control decks. Hive of the Eye Tyrant is a nice threat along with Mutavault to threaten your opponent even if they happen to remove all your stuff. Urborg obviously turns everything into a swamp, which is quite nice, and then Takanum allows you to rebuy threats. Beyond that, notable things in this deck, Knight of the Ebon Legion is a 1-drop that grows over time as you're dealing your opponent chunks of damage, but can also grow if you're dealing yourself damage with things like Thoughtseize and Castle Lockdwayne in a key turn, or say Murderous Routing something plus Thoughtseize can grow your own Knight of the Ebon Legion, just a tip to be aware of. Scrapheap Scrounger, as we've already said, is a 3-power 2-mana attacker that is a little bit resilient. Dread Wanderer and Blood-Soaked Champion are both 2/1s that attack quite decently into a lot of matchups, though they each have their drawbacks. Dread Wanderer comes into play tapped, and Blood-Soaked Champion cannot attack. And then one of the newer additions to the deck is Graveyard Trespasser. This kind of gives you a main deck graveyard hate piece while also being a reasonable threat on its own. Each time it attacks, it threatens to deal 1 damage to your opponent while getting you a little bit of life. It can help deal with things like Arclight Phoenixes and such out of the graveyard, or any type of like random things your opponent might have discarded out of like a Greasefang deck or something, keeping them from recurring their vehicles later if they don't get to do it all on the same turn. Murderous Rider is a 2-for-1 adventure creature, much like things like Bone Crusher Giant and Brazen Burrower. This sees some play in these mono black decks, which is both a way to kill planeswalkers and creatures, albeit at a bit of an expensive cost, while being a 2/3 lifelinker on the other side that allows you to kind of stabilize against some of the aggressive decks. Wrinkle used to be a very powerful top end in the format, now not so much, even as a hasty 3/3 flyer on turn 4. That said, whenever it connects, it's still a very powerful effect, allowing you to leverage whichever version. You have a lot of throwawayable creatures. You can force your opponent to sacrifice things. You can force each player to discard cards, where you get a little bit of advantage out of discarding things like Scrapheap Scrounger and such. And then each player drawing a card can help you refill your hand while also keeping your opponent taking a little bit of damage. And then beyond that, you run some interaction in the form of Power Word Kill, which kills a lot of creatures in the format, although notably problematic against the Angels matchup. But there aren't too many non-devil, non-dragon, non-demon, non-angel creatures, although Mayhem Devil does come to mind as a card that could be problematic with that particular removal spell of choice. Sideboard, as being monocolored, you are a little bit limited in your options. Most of what this revolves around is more forms of disruption, whether it be more removal spells, whether it be more discard spells, whether it be a little bit of grindiness against some of the mid-range control decks. Toward that end, you have Sorin the Mirthless, which is a powerful planeswalker that can both create threats and allow you to draw cards. Kalia's Trader of Get, very powerful 4-drop against the creature-based matchups. Goblink, very good against combo and control matchups, or some attrition matchups, although it's more for combo and control. Aethersphere Harvester, very good in racing matchups against other creature-based decks, whether they be spirits. Not necessarily as good against angels because they kind of go over the top of normal creature decks, but pretty good against spirits, mono blue, mono red, etc. Also decent against the human decks that are popping up a little bit. Unlicensed Hearst, additional graveyard hate along with the graveyard trespassers helps to keep the graveyard down for things like delve spells, arclight phoenixes, grease fangs, etc. Self-inflicted wound. This card is reasonable against anything, obviously, with green or white creatures. So, thinking angels, thinking mono green devotion, just as a way to keep them off their creatures. Legion Den, okay against things like mono green, killing their mana dorks, but more for other creature-based matchups, whether it be mono black mirror, humans, mono red, etc. And Heartless Act is just another removal spell. Taking a look at this version, this thing does a little bit differently. You're still seeing a lot of the same cards, just in different numbers. One removal spell here you're seeing is Epic Downfall. Exile target creature with 3 mana value or greater. This obviously kills a lot of problematic things that Fatal Push doesn't touch. And leaves you to deal with some of Mono Black's things, like getting a Cavalier of Thorns or a Old Growth Troll out of the way. Also very good at dealing with a lot of Phoenix's threats. Beyond that, the other notable thing is Spawn of Mayhem, which was one of the other key top ends of the thing when this deck was a powerful force. It can be a 4/4 flyer that you can get for 3 mana if you happen to have dealt your opponent damage. Then during your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to each player, and if you happen to have a 10 or less life, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So it can be quite a growing threat and can come down on turn 3, which is very powerful, but a little bit less so in today's format than it was previously. Duress, adding to your route. Different versions of disruption you can bring in against various different decks, whether it be against control decks, whether it be against Lotus Field, whether it be against some other combo deck you might run into. Goblink, same thing we've already discussed. Legion's End, good removal spell for tribal decks. Self-inflicted wound, good against mono green, decent against angels. And that Aethersphere Harvester we've already covered on as being mainly here for the mono red matchup, but pretty good against any other creature decks as well because it's quite easy to crew and gives you a little bit of flyer defense, which is one weakness of this deck, is it doesn't have a ton of flyers other than Rankle and Spawn of Mayhem. Finally, taking a look at this list, not a lot different in the main deck. Once again, the numbers are kind of bouncing around a little bit, but you get to see 2 copies of Witch's Vengeance, which is quite interesting against the tribal decks, especially spirits and angels in the early turns. This allows you to kind of wipe their board while also getting ahead because you're not killing your own creatures. Very important against humans, spirits, the other tribal decks that have kind of taken over where mono black used to be. And then Kalitas, kind of as your mop-up creature against other opposing creature decks. So the power of this deck is its ability to kind of, take on different roles. In mid-range control and combo matchups, you're definitely the aggressor with a little bit of disruption, poking your hole in what your opponent's key strategy is doing, whether it's taking their sweeper, taking their key combo piece, and kind of trying to kill them in quick efficient fashion. Or you can take the more controlling role against the other aggression decks, bringing in a bunch of removal spells that kind of fit the bill of whatever they're attacking with, and black having obviously the most powerful, almost unconditional based removal. As far as the deck's position in the format, the problem has become largely that its power level has not particularly increased since the advent of the format. It really hasn't got too many new cards other than maybe Graveyard Trespasser and a new removal spell here or there, which really isn't enough to swing the deck a ton. That said, it's still very good in a more heavy removal-based format, whereas decks like Mono Red, Mono Blue Spirits, those kind of decks can struggle with decks that are really, really overloaded on removal plus disruption. This deck can kind of thrive in those situations, but the meta is not particularly in that place right now, with Mono Green being kind of the deck du jour. Doesn't really care about those kind of disruptive elements all that much because it just kind of powers through with a bunch of 2-for-1s like Cavalier of Thorns, Planeswalkers, and Storm the Festival. This deck really kind of hard to find information on right now. Not a ton of people playing the deck out there, so I can't really give a good estimate on what its matchups are. That said, you can see it does have the tools to fight a lot of matchups. I can see it having a good Lotus Field combo matchup because you're able to add Disruption plus pressure. I can see it having decent matchups against other creature-based decks. I know when I played this deck a long time ago that both the mono red and the spirits matchups were quite interesting. I could see the Angels deck being a little bit tricky because while you do have a lot of removal spells, if they happen to hit Coco and a Coco and hit like Righteous Valkyrie and get a bunch of life and their creatures outside yours, that could be problematic. And then once as I've said, like especially blue-white control with its exiling-based removal, a little bit less of a fortunate matchup than it used to be. These Dimir piles might be a little bit easier to manage, as they don't tend to have as much exiling-based removal, though they do tend to have things like Graveyard Trespasser in their sideboard. So as far as the deck's positioning in the format, I don't really know because there's not enough results with it. That in and of itself should probably say that the deck isn't powerful enough, but this is a deck that a confident pilot can probably do fairly well with an FNM event or maybe a lower tier tournament. With disruption and getting information on your opponent's hand, being able to navigate your turns and kind of like forcing them to waste their removal on early threats and then closing out the game with Wrangle or Spawn of Mayhem. The problem becomes this deck is just not the best at what it was doing anymore. The Humans decks have kind of popped up, the Spirits variants have popped up, the Angels decks have popped up. A lot of these decks have kind of taken Black's mana share, and one of its most powerful tools is on the ban list, obviously, in Smuggler's Copter. So, this deck, while resilient and powerful, may not be quite enough to be a tier deck in the format right now, but it is a deck you should be aware of, especially if it ends up getting another piece or two. This could easily rise to being one of the best decks in the format again, as it's already proven that pedigree for several years before it's kind of slipped down in the face of some of the newer tools that a lot of these decks have been getting. So that said, it's kind of my take on Mono Black Aggro right now, kind of a overall what it's doing. If you want to beat it, you tend to play either an over-the-top deck that doesn't really care about what it's doing. Things like Mono Green could be a reasonable matchup, or just play a deck like Red Black mid-range or Niv that can just one-for-one this into the ground, exile some of its key stuff, and then just find a little bit of life gain and win from there. It's decent against the control decks, especially the non-blue-white versions, whether it be Izzet or the Dimir versions. So, in the face of those kind of things, this deck might be a little bit better as it can easily deal with things like Thing in the Ice and stuff, while also still pressuring your opponent. As far as the Lotus Field combo decks, it should have enough pressure plus disruption to have an okay matchup in that. I don't see it running things like Damping Sphere and stuff, so I could easily see this being a reasonable matchup for that. And then, this is a deck with a lot of play against the other aggressive decks, although it doesn't necessarily have the tools a lot of those decks have with things like Collected Company or, cheap 3-mana Planeswalkers like Chandra Dress to Kill, the Mono Red deck has access to. So I could easily see this being a deck that has a decent matchup against other creature decks, but as they gain more and more tools, maybe this deck will fall a little bit more behind. But, that said, all it takes is one or two really good 1, 2, or 3 drops, and suddenly this deck's back in the thing. So, something to keep an eye on, and a deck you should be aware of, and there might be somebody at your local store piloting this deck to some success. If you have any other tips or tricks on this deck, let me know, but that's kind of the basics of this deck, as someone asked me to kind of look into it, and it's pretty much what I found. And I had some previous experience playing it, but like I said, that was like over a year ago, so it's not the best up-to-date version, but I am familiar with some of the play patterns. So it's a deck that can be a little bit tricky to navigate, in terms of sequencing your early plays, especially if you have a Thoughtseize in the mix, when to take your opponent's key spell, kind of knowing the format a little bit as what your opponent's key turn is, what turn you want to poke a hole in their strategy. And then beyond that, it's just kind of managing your threats and managing your graveyard, especially as things like Dread Wonder and Scrapheap Scrounger can kind of fight with each other over resources in the graveyard, as whether you want to exile one of your other Bloodsoak champions or Dread Wanderers, bring back your Scrapheap Scrounger, or leave them in the graveyard for some other point in time. But that's it. This is Mono Black Aggro and our deep deck dive on it. And I hope to see you for the next video. Let me know which deck you want to see covered next.